might have to come to that. All right, good morning. A few more seconds before 9, though that clock is late. And I'm glad that y'all all remembered daylight saving time begins. A little story. When I was on the sub, I had to stand the midnight watch when the time change happened and we were going to spring forward. And it was really cool because a 6-hour watch became a 5-hour watch. So at that time, I really enjoyed spring forward. However, one of my guys, I told him, go around and change all the clocks, move them 1 hour forward. So he comes up to the first clock and it says 2:10. And so he has his little piece of paper and he puts 2:10 down on that piece of paper. And he puts 3:10 on the clock. And he goes to the next clock, 2:10. He takes 30 minutes to go through the whole boat and change all 27 clocks to 2:10. So now you have the first clock, it's at 2:30 or 2:40, and that last clock is at 2:10, right? So submarine guys, sometimes they're not the smartest. All right, let us begin. And Brian, I believe this is set up. It is sleepy. It's an hour behind. Well, so I wanted to go back and look at, so there were 2 changes I made to the slides we've talked about last class. Some on that, okay. I will do a post of the pictures of the slides we're going to talk about next week. Thank you, Brian. Okay. I'll post the pictures of the slides we're going to talk about in the upcoming week. I'll post those on Lightpost. They are pictures. And then occasionally, as I make updates to the slides, I will put the full slide deck on the files section of Lightpost. So y'all can go back and look at what we've talked about. And it'll have a few of the future slides on there as well. That way y'all can know what we talked about in the past. Y'all can have access to the links and all that good stuff. I want to review the purpose. So last week, it was proposed purpose. We all agreed that our purpose for this class will be to facilitate a sharing amongst ourselves of how selected Bible characters and we ourselves today consider the choices and decisions we make. That is what we agreed to. That is what we'll be discussing in this class. I really do not want, tangents can be fine. Woody's keeping account of how many tangents he has in his class. I'll keep account, and I'm going to try to keep it to 0. But I want us to stay on topic and make it about how do we make decisions and choices, and how do we interact with others when they make decisions and choices. And what I mean by that is sometimes we can assume the rest of the world makes choices and decisions because this is what they're looking at. I wish we would just ask them. I wish we would do something about that and not necessarily just assume and come in here and say, well, this is why the rest of the world is wrong. So let's talk about how we can do better in making choices and decisions. So that purpose, since we all agreed to it, it is no longer proposed. I have removed that word. We will look at this purpose at the beginning of class. Agenda, I added one thing here. Sometimes as I'm going through my notes, I forget something to talk about, just like I did last week. Or there may be something that somebody makes a point of, and I think about that, and I want to revisit that again in the next week. I'm going to call that previous class cleanup, okay? And then we'll talk about a brief outline about the character. I will have my points to discuss, and if you have a comment on those points, please feel free to make a comment about those points. And then we'll have a class discussion of your own points. As you know, and as I'm going to do, I'm going to let you know who are we going to talk about the next week. That way you have plenty of time to go study that character. So you can come back with your own points about what you see with the character as they make decisions and choices. Alrighty, so let's jump down. I'm not going to talk about this slide, but actually, I think in the past you can make it go blank, but I can't remember which button that is. So y'all don't have to worry about this slide. But here's the class cleanup from last week. I am going to call on people. If you do not wish to be called upon, this is my last time to say this, put your name on this yellow card, okay? Next week it is free game. If you do not want to be called out, make sure your name is on that card. If you are called out, I don't know is perfectly fine, okay? I don't know. Sometimes you really don't know what you would do in a situation, and that is perfectly fine. I'm not going to require the military answer, which is I don't know, but I will find out, sir. Okay? So I don't know is fine. I have made the slides a little bit bigger, and hopefully they show up. So I'm only going to have like 1 to 2 points, or maybe really 2 to 3 points on each slide. Looking at this, we could probably make these bigger. That way you guys can see it. However, I'm making these slides available the week before via the post on Lightpost. And the slides are also available, so you can go back, take your notes, and come to class, and you already have them ready to go. Man, I was hoping she was here because I didn't mention her last week because she wasn't. Y'all, I mentioned several times that I did those pre-class surveys, and one thing I really liked about that was I got a different way of, I would call categorizing things from an individual who doesn't normally speak up in this class, and that is Lauren Basham. I really appreciate when I like structure, okay? I was in the Navy, so obviously I like structure with its ranks and all that. Well, she has a good structure for how do people make decisions, and she called it gut, head, and heart, right? You know, and I wish she was here if she wanted to talk more about it. When I make a decision, I'm making it with my head, more so than I do with my heart. And gut, sometimes, you know, I will tell my guys at work, when we have a situation, and we don't have the time to use our head to determine the data and determine the solutions, what's your gut tell you, okay? But one thing I often don't use is my heart. So if I make a decision with my head, I have all the data, or my gut, based on my experience and what I think should happen, this is the path we need to take. Sometimes heart can get put off to the side with me. Somebody else who thinks with their heart, what are they going to think about how I make decisions and choices? Spoken from experience, I guess, right? When somebody else, in my opinion, makes a choice with their heart, well, how will this person feel? I don't care. It's the data to show this is the route we need to go. Having that structure, and I'm so glad she said that, gut, heart, head, it's a quick and simple way for us to think about how is this person thinking, and how do I need to come to their viewpoint, okay? Not to necessarily agree with their viewpoint, but to understand where they're coming from so we can have a good conversation towards moving forward. And then finally, Mike had said a comment, and by the way, I guess Mike has the mic again. If y'all remember, we talked about differences between choices and decisions. And some of the people, the articles said, you know, you make a choice, and then based on that choice, like a life choice, hey, I want to stand for something. I want to help this group. I want to be this type of person. And then the decisions should line up with that choice. Mike gave a good example of, in the past, making a decision to no longer drink. And then thereafter, it's a choice. And, you know, I started thinking about that, and maybe sometimes you're in a situation, and remember, decision, that word means to cut off, This is it. Everything. There's no other options at this point. A choice means you could come back to it and say, you know, I probably need to go this route. Well, if you think you've hit rock bottom, you know, you really have no other choice. Your life is not going the way that it needs to be. You make the decision, I've got to stop doing this. Over time, you're sober, you're getting better. Now it is a choice, right? Maybe the choice is, I don't need to go even into a store, make it, you know, now the example's escaping my head. When I was thinking of this, and I didn't write it down, the example was there on my head, but, you know, I need to stay away from those situations that could bring me back into that place. Y'all think about, we talked about this there in Romans 14, meat sacrificed to idols, right? Where had those Christians come from? Idol worshiping, had they not? And so for some of them, they could say, hey, I don't need to eat meat. I can eat meat offered to an idol because it means nothing. But for some of them, they said, I've made a decision to give my life to Christ. The choice is, right now, I need to not eat meat offered to idol. To me, it's a sin, okay? And so I think that's a good example of where you make a decision and the choice follows thereafter. And final thing, I know we talked a lot about stuff that it's not very, I don't want to say simple, it's not very direct. We're going to talk about a Bible character today, and really, for the rest of the course. It'll be pretty direct, right? It's right there. We're very familiar with those stories. Last week it takes a while to kind of go back and think about what are decisions and choices. What's considerations I need to make when I'm having a decision or choice to make. And so I know it might have been difficult to understand that. I appreciate y'all listening to it. I hope you go back and consider it. And I hope you go back and consider it because as we go through these next weeks with Bible characters, and I'm going to be quite honest here, I don't want to hear just, well, he trusted God and he did God's will. We could say that about everybody in the Bible, and I don't even need to spend the next 11 weeks teaching the class. There's more to these people than just they trusted God and they did God's will. I want to know, and I want you to know for yourself, what does trusting God look like? What does following God's will look like for you? All right? Because God's will is different for each one of us. And Paul, I forget to which church he said it, but he says, I'm going to use Justin Hatton language here, you need to go figure out what God's will is. And that's what I want this class to be about. Not necessarily to figure out what God's will is for you, because I don't know, but how do you figure it out? And how do other people figure it out so that maybe you can use that in your own life? All right, so that is the class cleanup. Now we will get into Daniel, okay? So y'all go ahead and turn to Daniel. Also, I'm going to make some assumptions here. I know when I do character studies, in fact, every Bible study I have done, every class I have done with you guys has been character studies. I like to go through and just list out everything that the character has done. For the sake of time, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to assume, and looking around, I think this is a good assumption, that everybody has grown up. They've heard these stories since Sunday school. So I don't need to go back and repeat what you already know. So we're just going to jump into the points. By the way, every time I think of Sunday school, one of the reasons I went to A&M, somebody once said there are 2 schools in Texas worth going to. Sunday school and Texas A&M. I had one of them. I made sure I got the other. So I'm good. Okay, and let me get my Bible up here. So if y'all turn to chapter 1 of Daniel. Now we all know this. Okay. Here's Daniel and several other people. We have his friends. But if you read through the text, it seems like there was more than just those 4 guys that were selected from amongst the Jews to be trained up and to serve the king. Daniel, it says there in verse 8, but Daniel proposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. And then, of course, the rest of the story, he and his friends, they do not want to do that. They want to eat fruit and, vegetables and water. The eunuch is concerned. They say, well, give us 10 days and we'll see what happens. The data will show whether we need to do this or not. And of course, they go 10 days and they look better than everybody else, and the eunuch says, y'all keep doing it that way. So I use this this is a good example of a choice and decision. Can anybody tell me what was the choice that was made here? And what was the decision that was made here? And again, I'll be silent until somebody answers, but I have my opinion. Y'all may have yours, so there's not necessarily a right answer here. But can anybody see where was the choice made? Looks like Greg's got something
I think
to
the
say.
choice was to not be defiled, and the decision was not to be defiled, and the choice was to not eat the meats and things from the king.
Okay, that could be true. He made the decision. He cut it off and said, "I'm not going to defile myself." And then he came back to the choice, and if they didn't look better than everybody else after the 10 days, right? Well, based on the definition of a choice, we get to circle back and say, okay, I need to go with the other option. Anybody else? Fred, I almost thought you were raising your hand there. You're just cleaning your glasses. I'm looking, guys. Y'all be careful. Don't scratch your heads. I would say if y'all remember, a choice is something not public. That was what one of the articles said. A choice can be inside you. He made a decision not to defile himself, and he specifically made a choice. He specifically made a choice to not defile himself by eating the king's food. And then the decision came when a decision is public. He says, I will not eat this. They wait the 10 days. Remember, based on the definition of a decision, what does that mean? It's a conclusion. It's a process, and we come to a conclusion that says this is the most effective answer. After those 10 days, the most effective answer was they don't need to eat the king's delicacies. Yes, sir.
So just to bring that home, instead of just saying, the king's food, think about what that is. That's bacon, sausage, pork. So, that's a staple right now. So their decision was not to do the things that are against the Jewish tradition.
Well, I'm glad you do, because you can make this a realistic point for today, right? Now, the Jews couldn't eat all the pork, but we sure can, right? But if your choice is to live a healthy life, if you propose in your heart not to defile your body with a lot of processed foods and fatty foods and sugary foods, you choose a healthy life, then what decisions are you going to make when it comes lunchtime and your tummy is grumbling for some food? I'm going to go eat the salad at Wendy's, right? And not that Big Mac at McDonald's. So we see where the people are making their decisions, not just for God, in this case, they were making it for God, but for we ourselves, the decisions and choices we make are just beyond the religious context, but they can go over into the secular as well. All right, second point here is, Lynn, yes?
You said that a choice is a personal thing, that it comes from within each individual. But shouldn't we be careful not to discount the fact that Daniel was not alone? He, I don't know if you would call him the leader of this group, but obviously there was some discussion before that choice was made to go to the eunuch who was in charge. So was it a group choice, or is that a group decision?
Lynn, you are leading me right into the second point, actually. And Lynn and I did not get together to talk about this, so perfect segue, thank you. Choosing our friends' influences. And if you'll give me a moment, I'll get to what I think will answer your question. We already said this earlier. If you read through the text, there were other Jews that were brought over, and that the king said, I want to raise these guys up to be my counselors, right? It was just not Daniel and his 3 friends. Now it's interesting in verse 8, who proposed in his heart? That's an easy one, guys. Y'all can tell me. Daniel, okay? What about the other 3? And now, I don't want to read too much in the text, right? But knowing human nature, have y'all ever seen one person who they proposed in their heart, and then what they propose in their heart, what they choose to do, permeates to all the people around them, and they too take a stand for what's right? Y'all ever seen that happen? Head nods. Remember, I got to see head nods to have feedback. Okay. I don't know if for the sake of brevity here, to save a few words, Daniel does not mention the other 3 when he's writing this, or if he proposed in his heart and then the other 3 came along. Regardless, if you take the text as it is, I know, let me finish the point and then I'll get to you, Stephen. Daniel proposed in his heart, and perhaps this influenced the other 3 to do the same. But to Lynn's point later, when you get to chapter 2, 17 and 18, the king has a dream. Nobody can interpret, nobody can even tell him what the dream is. He gets mad. He's going to kill all the wise men. Daniel goes into the king, says, give me time and let me figure out what happens. Who does he go back to? Verse 17 says, Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. We see him going back to that group of guys. Again, here's Daniel. Daniel went into the king. Daniel asked the king, give me some time. And I think that's so interesting. The king's wanting to kill Daniel and all the other wise men, and here comes Daniel. Hey, give me time. Let me see what God can reveal to me. But he goes back to these individuals, and they together now, they're working together to ask mercies of God. Stephen.
We were kind of talking about the defile portion and some mentions of right, wrong, all these different paths. But if I may kind of interject, Daniel made that resolve in his heart. He made that choice to not defile himself. But going back to, and I don't want to cross too much over, but if you look at Esther, she was in the exact same time frame that Daniel was here, right? There's not necessarily an overlap that we see in Scripture in the years, but she took all of the king's portions when she was getting prepped as a queen. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to sit here and say which one was wiser or not wiser in their choices, but the choice that Daniel made was for Daniel, and I think it influenced his friends. And I would say a wise decision to be stuck out and to be recognized as different and unique. And I think it set him up to look at those visions and dreams of the king and be seen as such. But Esther made decisions as well, and I don't think her choices that led to her decisions were necessarily wrong. So I look at that and I just want to toss out, I've never necessarily read this portion of Daniel and saying, well, good, all the other Jews were doing horrible things. I think it was a choice he made. I think it was a good choice he made. But it doesn't mean it was the right choice. It was a choice, and I think potentially set him up to represent God better.
Good point, and I'm glad you said that. We're actually talking Esther next week, so I'll have to think about that and see if it's something we can make a point of from next week, but good point. So we see choosing our friends and influences. And I asked some teachers here to share with us some examples. You know, at work, we're usually seeing the same people year in to year out. But in our schools, you're with those kids, and I'm sure sometimes you're thankful you're only with those kids for 9 months. And then they move on, maybe not with high school. You get to see them continually, right? But you're getting to see people, young people who, again and again, are learning this principle of choosing their friends and influences. So, John and Savannah, if y'all can share with us what examples y'all have seen of people who have had those bad influences, good influences, and especially people who've made the swap, and then you start seeing them get better.
I think I also want to start this by saying I think there's a big difference in friends and influences. I think your family is a big influence, and you don't choose that; you're born into that. And at Lufkin, especially, thank you. At Lufkin, you see so many kids that have such a low socioeconomic status, and they did not choose that. And they are surrounded by people who are maybe making not great choices. And so the choices that would seem wrong to us as people who maybe have had great influences from our families, the easy choice for some of these kids is the wrong one: drugs, alcohol, gang activity, whatever. But I started out here at the middle school. So the kids who are in 10th grade now, I've seen them since they were in 7th grade. And there's a particular pair of boys that when they were in 7th and 8th grade, they were really good buddies. But whenever they came to 9th grade, one of them has a family, like their family is in gangs and they're in drugs and all that kind of stuff. And these are also kids that have intellectual disabilities. So on some level, they are not going to be able to go to college maybe the same way the rest of us had that ability to. Socially, they're like everyone else, but they have a much higher mountain to climb. But one boy, he got into gangs and he's in jail now for things that he did over Christmas. And another boy, he has a better family who maybe encourages him to not do those things. And they had a big separation when he was in 9th grade, and he said, "I'm not doing that. Like, I don't have any interest in engaging in that kind of stuff." And so that's probably the best example, I think, to me. But I think his parents or his grandma, I think he lives with his grandma, I think his grandma influenced that more than maybe like his peers did. So
I'm going to try to eloquently follow that up. I know something I look into, especially being on the athletic side of school, is and I'm at the smaller school in Central. And so I see our kids hang out more with various grade levels, which when I grew up, we didn't really do that because I was at a big school, like similar to Lufkin size. And we tell, I know I've told my athletes, like, y'all got to be careful who you hang around with because, you're hanging out with kids that are perpetually in trouble, perpetually doing really, really dumb stuff. And I was like, sooner or later, you're going to get caught up in that, and you've got to be mature enough to understand those decisions of cutting off those friends because, if you're running around with a bad group, they're going to pull you down. If you're running around with a better group, you're going to see more success coming out of what you do because they're going to try to make sure you're not caught in a bad situation. And so, yeah, I think that answers that question.
No, and thank you. And then, Savannah, that's good insight about the influences. I wasn't around 50 years ago, but everybody kind of had the same type of family, right? So if a person made bad decisions and choices, from our perspective, that was on them. But nowadays, we can't just assume that. They don't know any better in some cases because they haven't been raised better. Should that have a change on how we view them and how we interact with them to bring them to Christ? All right, we got 15 minutes. I'm going to go through the next ones pretty quickly because I do want to give y'all time to make other points that y'all have found. Our choices and decisions can influence or at least be understood and perhaps appreciated by others. So I'm going to go through a list here. On several occasions, Nebuchadnezzar realizes God is a powerful God. When Daniel interprets that dream, or rather God interprets that dream through Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar calls him the God of gods, lowercase gods, okay? He's like, hey, God is the God of all the other gods, right? But, let's see. And then we kind of see the next step. When Daniel's 3 friends survived that fire, Nebuchadnezzar says, no one can speak bad about the God of these 3 men, or they shall be cut in pieces. So we see a progression. First, he's like, hey, yeah, okay, God is a pretty good God. Now, nobody can talk bad about these guys as God. But if y'all turn to Daniel 6, 4 through 29, specifically 6:16. Now this is Darius. He's made a rule. Nobody can petition God for 30 days. The only person you could petition in my kingdom for 30 days is me. And what does Daniel go and do, as is his custom? He goes and prays, okay? And of course, Daniel's been set up. And Daniel knew it, because it says he knew it and he went to pray, so he knew he was being set up. Somebody read verse 16, and I hope it's verse 16. That's what I have in my notes. As Daniel's being lowered into the lion's den, what does the king tell him? Stephen's going to read it for me, and thank you, Stephen.
Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you."
So here's a king. Now, if you think about it, why did Darius still have to throw Daniel into the lion's den? He was very upset with himself when they said, "Hey, your boy Daniel, he broke your law." I don't think Daniel waited 30 days to then pray. He probably prayed day one. So this is still day one. Guess what is still in effect? The law. And here's Darius, who is not a worshiper of God. And what does he recognize about Daniel? Your God, whom you serve continually, who you broke my law to serve, he will deliver you. Here is Daniel. He has served godless kings. In fact, one of them took over the kingdom. He served two kingdoms, the Babylonians and then the Persian Medes. Do you think he has some influence with people? Do we have that same influence with people? If we go out into the community, let me just say, do we go out into the community? Are we engaged? You know, Lynn is a good example of somebody who reaches out and works with community organizations. Are we doing that? If they're not going to come in here, it's not like the Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. We need to go out. And we need to be making decisions just like Daniel did. How can I get engaged with other groups so that they can have an opportunity to hear about my God? Stephen.
I'm sorry, Justin, or
Go ahead.
everybody else. Daniel is one of my favorite stories. So in prepping for this, I was very excited. When we look at what Daniel did and the influence he made, you're talking about going out into the community. Notice what happened when the law was made, and I think it's very important that we see this. Verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had the window in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. He did not go to the street corners. He did not go and riot. He did not go and yell. He did not go and scream. He stayed the course. And I think it's important that we notice the influence he had as one of peace, one that he continued in the way he believed and he knew to be true. He didn't change who he was or change how he acted. He stayed the same. And when we look at Hebrews 13 at the end, it talks about how we influence in this world, and what we are to continue to do is be the hands and feet of God. We talk about how we influence in society. That's how. This society is missing the hands and feet of Jesus. That's what Daniel did. He just stayed the course.
You actually, man, between you and Lynn, y'all are making good segues into my next point. If anybody else has a point on this, please let me know before we go to the next point, which would tailor very well with what you just said. No, I'll tell you. Told y'all, don't be scratching your heads. I want to call on you. Here's our next point. Choosing to follow God lends itself towards a consistent decision-making and process, okay? Daniel has a consistent process of making choices to follow God and decisions about how to act in relation to that choice. We see it building up the whole time. He's taken from his home country, taken to a foreign country, given king's the king's food. He makes a choice and a decision. I'm not going to defile myself with that. His life is threatened. Okay, what does he do? Does he run away? No, he goes before the very guy who is going to have him killed and says, give me time and God will interpret the dream. And then as Stephen just points out, he has this law passed, or this law is passed, and what does he do? Take a peaceful, as he always had done, as was his custom. When we make choices and decisions, and we choose to follow God, and we make decisions based on that, how can I follow God? How can I share the gospel with others? It lends itself towards a consistent decision-making process. And I use that word very specifically, lends. I did not say leads. Because it is still upon us. We still have a responsibility to make good life decisions and choices. If you remember, if you follow God, but you don't save for retirement, you chose to not save for retirement if you had the opportunity to do so. If you follow God, but you don't choose to maintain your body, when you're older, you're going to pay for that. So I say lens because it can if you take responsibility for your decisions and choices. Daniel took responsibility for his decisions and choices. When he knew that law had been passed, he said, I still have a responsibility to pray to God. And he made the decision and he prayed to God. Heather.
I think there's a lot to be said for routine and habit in the decision-making process because it says that Daniel had continued to do what he had always done. So he obviously had those habits in place and a routine kind of in place. And sometimes we might struggle to find time to pray and communicate with God and really make that relationship that we need to. And it's because we haven't purposed the routine or purposed the habit for it. And, some people hate structure. But there is something to be said for it because it plays a part in your decision-making process because you already have those habits in place that lead to good decisions.
Thank you, Heather, and that's a good point. I would say we don't want to get into habits to where the habits are the right answer necessarily, but I would say, as somebody who is structured, in fact, this is my structure right here. I have my planner. But getting into habits does help me make decisions, and it helps me make the decisions at the right time, okay? But very good point, Heather. Last point that I'll make, and then we'll open up for about 5 minutes or so for class discussion. When we need to consider, and this is not easy because we can't look out and see, here's the impact of the decision I'm about to make on people further away from me than I know, 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon type thing. Or what's going to be the impact of this in the future, right? We can't tell that. But it always strikes me, here is King Darius. Out of all of his 150 satraps and administrators, who was his favorite? Daniel. In fact, he was thinking of making him the top dog, other than him, in the whole kingdom. So here comes all his other guys. Hey, King Darius, you should make a law that nobody can pray to another god unless they come to you and petition you for 30 days. Now, who was not there, obviously? His number one dog, right? If I had everybody else coming to me, and my top guy is not coming, what am I going to say? Huh? Well, where's your data? In this case, where's my Daniel? Okay? Why? Have y'all ran this by Daniel? I would. The king did not do that, did he? And it's interesting. Remember, what did we talk about? Who did he know Daniel did? Or who did he know Daniel served? God whom you serve continually. Now, the king obviously was just like, oh, everybody has to come to me for 30 days? I like that. Let's do that. Yeah. He was not thinking, what is going to be the impact? And here is my number one guy who I'm thinking about putting in charge of everything. I know he serves God continuously. He's not here. I'm not getting his input. Decision made. That was a foolish decision, wasn't it? Mike.
Did he make that decision with his head, his gut, or his heart?
Oh, good one. Good, Mike. Mike, extra points. You're paying attention in class. Obviously not head. In my opinion, I think it's clear to me, not head. Probably more heart because he's feeling prideful. That's right. Mike.
The other point related to that, obviously he had massive respect for Daniel and the God he served, even though he may not have served that same God.
Yes, sir. And then we have
I was
Heather.
just going to say real quick, most kings are born into their position. They didn't get there because of their brain or anything, accounted to them. And so that was probably his situation.
We need to remember that our God is an awesome God, and he can work through all kinds of circumstances. Daniel did not run away, and God was able to work through him. Jonah did run away, and God was able to make a way for him to come back.
Yes, ma'am.
So it doesn't matter if we make all the quote-unquote right decisions according to the business of the day. God can still work through us and for us if we serve him.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Whenever you see the other men that Daniel worked with, one, I would not say that godly would have been what represented them. So Daniel is living in a place where the lack of godliness or sinfulness is all around him. And his continual influence leads to that statement in verse 5. We cannot find any ground for complaint against him unless we find a connection between his law, the law of his God. And so the influence there, the impact, everybody knows who Daniel is and what he stands for. And Daniel was not one that was addressed or impacted by the evil around him. He just continued and stayed the course. You think about today, and you look at this, what would be a comparison to persecution, right? What Daniel faced, that is persecution. They literally targeted, how can we get him in trouble? Mm-hmm. And we think of persecution today, for me, it would be if the law, or if there was a law written that stated you are no longer able to be kind to someone. I'm like, wow, I'm not going to stop that. Or you're no longer able to help the needy. Well, I'm not going to stop that. You think that is the comparison of the law, right? You're no longer able to pray to God. Like, that is the persecution. And that's, when we think about today, what would that impact be of the government if we were put in a position where they literally did exactly what was done here? Mm-hmm. So I haven't seen laws like that, right? I see evil continuance around us, but I don't see laws like that.
Thank you. Mr. Bolin.
Well, I'm a little more simple-minded than you engineers. But thinking about what these men did that came to the king, they came in deception to get him to do what they wanted to protect their positions. And they deceived the king into making this law.
And they knew how to deceive him, didn't they? They knew to appeal to his pride, as Everett said. Lynn.
We all grew up going to Sunday school, and we all heard the story of Daniel and the lion's den and how the angel came and shut the mouth. And I'm glad that at least in the little kids' classes, they don't finish that story, but you see the end of that story where not only does the king counsel Daniel and say, your God will protect you, but then those people who were so deceitful were punished. Mm-hmm. That very thing that they wanted to happen to Daniel happened to them and their wives and their children. And, as thankfully in the little kids' classes, we don't. And then there's this bloodbath for all the kids, and, but we don't do that. We are currently in a society where, and what Stephen was talking about makes me mindful of this. We don't see any laws yet that say, well, you can't be kind or you can't do this. But watch carefully the direction that things are beginning to go. You know, if we continue to go down a path where you have to accept whatever anybody says, because, you know, if I came in today and said, well, today I am a black homosexual preacher of the gospel, and because that's how I see myself, you have to see me that way too. Now that borders on the absurd and the extreme, but that's where things are headed. Mm-hmm. But it was no different for Daniel in that time, and what we talked about him staying that course and having his routine is more important today than it has ever been, because of all of the things that we face, and we go, well, that's just absurd. Nobody believes that. And yes, they do. and they're going to insist that you believe it and accept it too. And we have to continue to realize that our God is an awesome God, and he'll protect us, but we have to stay that course.
Yes, sir. That was the last bell. Does anybody have any comments left to say on Daniel? Okay. If you do, let me know. We have the class follow-up on the agenda now, or rather previous class cleanup, and I can have you speak to that. I especially appreciate everybody who's also looking at this beyond just my points and bringing connections, whether it be with Esther or Jonah. One of the intents I want with this class is Daniel may not be your favorite character, so you may not go to him for how to make decisions. Jonah may be. So I want to hit these people, because then when you're in that situation, you could say, Jonah, who I really like, here's something he did wrong, but it got better for him. God still used him. Next week, we will be talking Esther. These are the items. Responsive choices and decisions must be appropriate to the initial cause. I want you to think about when Haman was disrespected by Mordecai, what did he do? Right? Others can help guide us in our choices and decisions. Think about Esther. She had a choice, going before the king. Who helped her? Choices can be difficult in life, changing, or even life-threatening. Okay? Again, thinking about Esther and the concern she had about going before the king. And this is one reason I really like the book of Esther. I have not found any mention of God in it, and yet somebody's having to make a choice without being told by God what to do. Does that not sound like what we have to do today? I've not had God directly tell me, hey, Justin, you need to get a job here. You're going to be happy. That is the right choice. I've not had him do that. How did Esther and Mordecai come to the conclusion of how do they decide and choose what they were going to do? Think about that. Study it. Next week, we'll talk about Esther. Y'all have a good week, and thank y'all again.